You say no, but instead of stopping there, you start explaining yourself nonstop. Why do you feel the need to justify yourself, apologize, or give reasons that no one asked for? Why does saying no leave you with guilt, anxiety, or the feeling of having done something wrong? And the most unsettling, why can some people refuse with a single sentence while you feel you must convince others? Stay, because understanding this is not about communication, but about deep psychology. Saying no should be simple, a short, clear, and sufficient word. However, for many people, that word is accompanied by a chain of explanations, apologies, and justifications that seem impossible to stop. I can't today. It's just that I'm very tired. Plus, I have other things. It's nothing personal. I'd really love to. But right now, I can't. After saying it, guilt appears. The mind replays the conversation over and over again. Anxiety arises about how the other person might have reacted, the feeling of having been selfish, cold, or wrong. This pattern doesn't appear out of nowhere. It has deep roots and usually forms very early. Many people learned that saying no had consequences: rejection, conflict, emotional punishment. To avoid it, they developed an unconscious strategy, softening the boundary with explanations. It wasn't about communicating better. It was about protecting oneself. With time, the brain associates the direct refusal with danger. So it tries to compensate by offering reasons, details, and excuses, as if the no by itself were not enough. The problem is that this strategy, which once might have served, becomes exhausting in adult life. Each boundary turns into a negotiation. Each refusal feels like an emotional debt. The most important thing is to understand this. If you feel guilt when saying no, it's not because you're doing something wrong. It is because your nervous system learned that setting boundaries was unsafe. This pattern usually goes unnoticed because it's normalized. People applaud those who explain themselves, those who are considerate, those who don't cause discomfort. But the internal cost is high: emotional fatigue, resentment, constant feeling of being available for everyone, except for yourself. And here a key question arises. What if explaining too much wasn't a personality trait, but a learned response? To understand it, first we must look at how some minds process information differently. Not everyone over-explains out of fear. In some cases, the need to detail doesn't stem from guilt, but from the way the brain processes information. There is a type of cognitive processing called bottom-up. In this model, the mind builds understanding from details, not from general conclusions. First comes the data, then the meaning. People with this type of processing usually feel that an incomplete explanation is, at its core, an incorrect explanation. They don't seek to convince, they seek to be precise. This pattern is common in people with ADHD, autism, spectrum traits, or simply a highly analytical mind. For them, omitting details creates internal discomfort, not because they fear external judgment, but because they feel they haven't communicated the complete reality. From the outside, it may look like insecurity, but on the inside, it's experienced as coherence. The problem appears when this cognitive style mixes with social contexts that don't require so much information. The mind follows its internal logic, but the environment interprets the excess explanation as doubt or a lack of firmness. Here is where many people get confused. They think they must correct themselves, that something is wrong with their way of communicating. But it's not like that. Bottom-up processing is not a defect. It is a different mental architecture. However, it is crucial to differentiate this cognitive style from another very different phenomenon, one that is born from fear and not from brain structure. When you explain because you enjoy sharing details, that is information. When you explain because you fear disappointing, that is defense. Most people who suffer when saying no are not simply informing. They are trying to avoid a negative reaction. Understanding this difference is key. Not all excess explanation should be eliminated, only that which arises as a self-protection response. And to understand that response, we must talk about a specific psychological mechanism, one that activates when saying no feels dangerous. When saying no activates fear, the body doesn't think about communication. It thinks about survival. In addition to the known responses to stress, flight, fight, or freeze, there is a fourth, less visible reaction: fawning. It's the tendency to please, give in, and over-explain to avoid conflict. People who developed this response learned, consciously or unconsciously, that maintaining harmony was safer than setting boundaries. Not because they were weak, but because at some point they needed to adapt. In family or social contexts where disagreement generated emotional punishment, rejection, or constant tension, the brain found a solution. If I explain myself well, if I am understanding, if I don't cause discomfort, I will be safe. With time, this pattern becomes automated. Real danger is no longer needed. The mere possibility of disappointing someone is enough for the body to react. That is why many people don't just say no. They wrap it, they soften it, they justify it, they transform it into something almost unrecognizable. They aren't communicating. They are asking for permission to have a boundary. The problem is that fawning doesn't eliminate conflict. It only shifts it inward. The other person may be satisfied, but you are left exhausted, resentful, or with the feeling of having betrayed yourself. This mechanism also explains why, even after explaining for minutes, the guilt doesn't go away. Because the explanation was never the real goal. The goal was to feel safe. Understanding this completely changes the narrative. You don't over-explain because you're bad at communicating. You do it because your nervous system learned that saying no without embellishments was risky. And here an uncomfortable truth appears. The more you explain yourself from fear, the less clear your boundary becomes. Not because the words are wrong, but because the message you convey isn't firmness, but negotiation. And this leads us to the next point, one that few people want to accept. The way you say no doesn't just communicate your decision, it also communicates your position. There is a silent social rule that almost no one mentions, but everyone perceives. The more you explain yourself, the less solid your boundary seems. It's not fair, but it's real. In human interactions, clarity conveys security, and security is usually interpreted as status. People who occupy positions of authority rarely justify every decision. Not because they don't have reasons, but because they don't feel the need to convince. Their no is presented as a final point. When you over-explain, the implicit message isn't consideration, it's doubt. Not doubt about the content, but about your right to decide. The excess of reasons opens an invisible door, the door to negotiation. The other person hears your arguments and unconsciously begins to evaluate them. If a reason seems weak, they try to refute it. If a circumstance changes, they insist again. Thus, the no stops being a decision and becomes a debate. This phenomenon is related to what social psychology calls status signaling. People with high status explain less because they don't need to justify their autonomy. People who feel they must justify themselves communicate, unintentionally, a lower position in the social hierarchy. This doesn't mean someone is less valuable. It means the perceived message changes. And here a paradox appears. The more you try to be polite, understanding, and considerate, the more likely it is that your boundary will be questioned. Not because others are malicious, but because human language responds to signals, not just words. Over-explaining also consumes something fundamental: energy. Each justification is an additional effort to sustain a decision that was already made. And most importantly, respect is not obtained by convincing. It is obtained by showing consistency between words and action. If your no needs too many reasons to hold up, it stops being a boundary and becomes a request for approval. Understanding this dynamic is uncomfortable, but necessary, because only when you understand why it happens can you start to change the way you relate to your own boundaries. And before learning how to do it, we must clarify something essential. Not all excess explanation is equal. Not every extensive explanation is born from fear. And confusing these two things can lead to shutting down a valuable part of your personality. There is a clear difference between info dumping and defensive explaining. Info dumping occurs when you share information because you're interested, passionate, or find it relevant. You speak with enthusiasm, with curiosity, with the genuine desire to go deeper. There is no tension in the body, no rush to be accepted. There is only exchange. Defensive explaining is different. It appears when the body is on alert, when the voice speeds up, when you feel the need to justify yourself even before someone asks. In that moment, you aren't sharing. You are defending yourself. The key to distinguishing them is not in the amount of words, but in the internal feeling. Info dumping expands. Defensive explaining contracts. Many people, upon discovering that over-explaining can reduce respect, try to eliminate any explanation. They become rigid. They repress themselves. That is not the goal. You don't need to stop being detailed. You need to stop explaining yourself out of fear. Here an important concept appears: strategic selfishness. It's not about being cold or distant. It's about prioritizing your energy in context where it really matters. Before explaining, a simple question can change everything. Am I sharing because I want to or because I fear the other person's reaction? If the answer is fear, the explanation will not protect you. It will only prolong the discomfort. Caring for your energy is not selfishness. It's personal responsibility. Many people confuse kindness with self-sacrifice. But setting clear boundaries is also a form of respect toward yourself and toward others. This shift in focus doesn't imply confrontation. It implies clarity. And that clarity relies on a simple but powerful tool, a rule that can transform the way you say no without losing authenticity. There is a simple rule that completely changes the way boundaries are established. It's known as JAD: justify, argue, defend, or explain. When you say no and enter into any of these four actions, your boundary stops being a boundary and becomes an invitation to debate. Not because the other person wants to manipulate you, but because the language itself opens that space. Every justification creates a crack. Every argument offers something that can be discussed. Every defense implies that there is an attack. Every explanation suggests that the no is not yet closed. That's why many people feel that the more they explain, the less effective their refusal is. The problem is not the clarity, it's the structure of the message. A complete no doesn't need support. It needs closure. Saying "I can" on Friday is a finished sentence. It doesn't invite negotiation. It doesn't contain hidden doors. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also honest. The silence that follows is usually the hardest thing to tolerate. That second in which you don't know how the other person will react. That space where the body wants to fill in with more words. That's where internal respect is built. Not responding immediately is not coldness. It's allowing the boundary to exist without justification. Many people confuse firmness with aggressiveness, but real firmness is calm. It doesn't push. It doesn't defend itself. It simply holds. Practicing this doesn't mean becoming insensitive. It means stopping over-explaining yourself to be accepted. The other person's reaction is no longer under your control, and it never was. When you eliminate JADE, you discover something important. Whoever respects your boundaries doesn't need explanations. Whoever doesn't respect them won't be satisfied with them either. This is a natural filter, silent, but very revealing. And this leads us to the final closing, to the idea that connects all the previous ones and explains why learning to say no without explaining yourself is, in reality, a way to care for the most valuable thing you have. Every time you over-explain, you're not just giving information, you're giving away energy, time, attention, emotional burden, and you do it many times to avoid a discomfort that lasts a few seconds. But the internal cost can last hours, days, or even years. Learning to say no without explaining yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you conscious. Conscious that your energy is limited. Conscious that not everyone needs to understand your reasons. Conscious that your well-being doesn't depend on the constant approval of others. The silence that follows a clear no acts as a natural filter. People who respect your boundaries accept it without drama. Those who get uncomfortable reveal something important. It's not your responsibility to manage other people's emotions, only your own. This doesn't mean that you should close the door to empathy. It means that empathy shouldn't cost you your peace. When you stop over-explaining, something changes in your relationship with yourself. You start to trust your judgment, to validate your decisions without asking for permission. At first, the silence is uncomfortable. The body wants to fill it. The mind wants to justify itself. But with time, that silence becomes solid. You don't need to convince to have the right to decide. You don't need perfect reasons to set boundaries. Your no is sufficient. And here is the final paradox. The less you explain yourself, the clearer you become. The clearer you become, the less you need to speak. The power is not in the words you add. It is in the ones you choose not to say.